They called it a miracle birth. But behind the heavy wooden doors of the Spanish palace in 1661, what emerged wasn't salvation. It was a biological catastrophe. Midwives didn't cheer. They didn't raise a cry of joy. They wept. Shaking, they whispered to one another, "He's not right." Spain had a new prince, Charles II. But he didn't cry, couldn't nurse. His tongue was too large, his limbs limp like wax. And still, they cheered, because the blood in his veins was sacred, royal, divine, or so they told themselves. But here's the truth. This wasn't a prince. This was the monstrous culmination of centuries of incest, pride, and power. The Habsburg family had sealed their fate with cousin kisses, uncle-niece weddings, and a belief that their blood was too precious to mix with commoners. Over generations, their gene pool had folded in on itself like rotting silk until it gave birth to a king whose body was barely human. Charles II was the end result of an empire that chose power over sanity. His very existence was a silent scream, a warning dressed in silk, and yet the illusion had to be maintained. Nobles bowed, priests blessed him, portraits were painted with lies, but behind those golden-framed illusions, the truth grew louder. You're not watching a biography. You're witnessing a descent into institutional psychosis. Because this isn't just the story of a broken king, it's the story of how an entire empire collapsed in slow motion, while everyone smiled and said, "Long live the king." We begin with a queen who gave birth to a curse. But no one dared say what they all knew, that this divine bloodline had become a prison of flesh and madness. The Habsburgs weren't just monarchs. They were breeders in a political experiment gone grotesquely wrong. Generation after generation of strategic incest had carved a path not toward power, but toward biological collapse. And the boy in the cradle, Charles II, was proof. A silent, malformed child, baptized in gold, but born already broken. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both niece and wife to her king. Her bloodline was a spiral, looping endlessly back on itself. She was chosen not for her mind, not for her temperament, not even for her fertility, but because her veins ran with the same tainted strain the dynasty had guarded for centuries. She was the perfect Habsburg match, and that's precisely why her child was doomed. They say the family tree didn't branch, it twisted, backwards, inward, suffocating itself. Joanna of Austria, one of Charles's ancestors, was so deeply inbred that paintings of her lineage resemble a hall of mirrors, each reflection distorted, the same chin, the same jaw, the same madness passed down like a crown. By Charles's birth, the inbreeding coefficient of the Spanish Habsburgs was higher than if two siblings had conceived a child. His jaw jutted out grotesquely, his tongue was too large, his eyes couldn't focus, his skull pulsed visibly under candlelight. The midwives prayed, the nobles smiled, and the priests whispered that perhaps God's will was unknowable, but everyone felt it. This was not a child who would save the empire. This was the reckoning. Spain, by then, was not just ruled by corruption, it was corruption. It clung to tradition like a lifeline, ignoring the rot at its core. The dynasty had grown too proud to see its own decay, too desperate to let go, too terrified to tell the truth. So they dressed the boy in silks, gave him tutors, titles, and toys, and told the world he would grow strong. But beneath the velvet, his body was unraveling, and what no one realized was that so was the empire. They crowned him not because he was capable, but because they had no other choice. Charles II, the last of Spain's Habsburg line, was not born to rule. He was born to be displayed, a fragile marionette draped in royal finery, presented to the world as continuity, while behind palace walls, the dynasty crumbled in silence. Every breath he took was choreographed, every appearance a performance. The boy king was a mask, one meant to hide the monstrous reality that centuries of unchecked power had wrought. He couldn't walk until he was nearly 6, couldn't chew, couldn't speak without drooling or gagging, and still they dressed him in gold-trimmed robes and called him Majestad. They celebrated his birthday with fireworks. They painted portraits that turned his slack jaw into a noble pose. They forced the world to believe the lie, because believing the truth meant facing a much darker fear, that their divine order had become a curse. Behind those palace walls, reality screamed. Charles's tutors despaired in private. He couldn't read, couldn't retain thoughts. He was easily startled by noise, light, and sudden movement. Sometimes he'd stare for hours at candle flames, his mind tracing shapes in the fire like it held ancient truths only he could see. At other times he'd lash out, slapping servants, tearing his garments, biting the wooden arms of his throne like an animal. One French ambassador wrote, "The king appears less like a man and more like a holy relic kept alive by incense and denial." And he was right. But the machine kept moving. The priests prayed harder. The nobles smiled wider. The court spent lavishly on distractions, parades, theater, and music, all to drown out the groaning rot within the foundation of the empire, because if Charles fell, the illusion fell with him. And so his mother ruled in his name, whispering decrees through veils, signing laws with hearts. His signature, presenting his silence as divine contemplation. The truth? The boy was barely conscious. He was deteriorating by the hour. But the Habsburg legacy, Spain's destiny, was now shackled to his broken frame, and no one dared cut the rope. There were no real nights in the palace anymore, only dim, sickly candlelight flickering across ceilings like dying stars. Charles didn't sleep, not truly. He muttered, twitched, cried out in the darkness for people who'd been dead for centuries. Nurses said he spoke Latin in his sleep, but he'd never learned Latin. Priests claimed it was a sign, divine possession or divine punishment. Either way, it was convenient. They could keep lying. But behind the locked doors and velvet curtains, Spain's enemies were sharpening knives. The French watched. The Austrians listened. Inside the Spanish court, every noble was a spy, every servant a whisperer. The question haunted every chamber. Who would take the throne when the monster finally died? There was no heir. There never could be. Charles's body was incapable. His marriages had been farces, consummated in ritual, but never in flesh. His seed was ash, lifeless, like the blood that birthed him. Still, the church clung to the idea of continuity. Still, the court performed. Each morning, they dressed Charles in robes that hung loose on his disintegrating frame. They combed thinning hair, placed the crown on a skull that had never properly formed, and they paraded him like a saint, sick, trembling, and sacred, a living martyr to a dying world. But outside those walls, reality was breaking in. Peasants revolted for bread. Colonies whispered sedition. Even the air of Madrid had changed, heavy with rot, salt, and iron. Storms battered the coast. Crops failed. The people began to say it aloud now. The king is cursed. But they were wrong. He wasn't cursed. He was the curse. The Habsburg dynasty had twisted itself into oblivion. What remained wasn't a family. It was a relic, a symbol of everything that happens when power becomes incestuous, when purity becomes poison, when control replaces truth. And Charles, he wasn't just a victim. He was the final seal, the lock on a vault of horrors the world had tried to forget. This is where empires go when they refuse to evolve. They don't explode. They putrefy. And still, the court whispered prayers, Still the portrait painters lied. Still the cathedral bells rang. Because to admit the truth now would mean admitting it had always been a lie. There were no real nights in the palace anymore, only dim, sickly candlelight flickering across ceilings like dying stars. Charles didn't sleep. Not truly. He muttered, twitched, cried out in the darkness for people who'd been dead for centuries. Nurses said he spoke Latin in his sleep, but he'd never learned Latin. Priests claimed it was a sign, divine possession or divine punishment. Either way, it was convenient. They could keep lying. But behind the locked doors and velvet curtains, Spain's enemies were sharpening knives. The French watched. The Austrians listened. Inside the Spanish court, every noble was a spy, every servant a whisperer. The question haunted every chamber: who would take the throne when the monster finally died? There was no heir. There never could be. Charles's body was incapable. His marriages had been farces, consummated in ritual, but never in flesh. His seed was ash, lifeless, like the blood that birthed him. Still, the church clung to the idea of continuity. Still, the court performed. Each morning, they dressed Charles in robes that hung loose on his disintegrating frame. They combed thinning hair, placed the crown on a skull that had never properly formed, and they paraded him like a saint, sick, trembling, and sacred, a living martyr to a dying world. But outside those walls, reality was breaking in. Peasants revolted for bread. Colonies whispered sedition. Even the air of Madrid had changed, heavy with rot, salt, and iron. Storms battered the coast. Crops failed. The people began to say it aloud now: the king is cursed. But they were wrong. He wasn't cursed. He was the curse. The Habsburg dynasty had twisted itself into oblivion. What remained wasn't a family. It was a relic, a symbol of everything that happens when power becomes incestuous, when purity becomes poison, when control replaces truth. And Charles, he wasn't just a victim. He was the final seal, the lock on a vault of horrors the world had tried to forget. This is where empires go when they refuse to evolve. They don't explode. They putrefy. And still, the court whispered prayers. Still the portrait painters lied. Still the cathedral bells rang. Because to admit the truth now would mean admitting it had always been a lie. In the marble chapel of the Escorial, they began burning incense not for worship, but to mask the stench. Charles II had started to rot while still alive. His attendants bathed him twice a day, but it wasn't enough. The swelling in his legs had turned to weeping sores. His gums bled when he spoke. When he defecated, it came black and tar-like, laced with blood. His breath carried the scent of death long before death arrived. And yet, he ruled. Or rather, the illusion of rule persisted. Orders were issued in his name, treaties signed with his crooked signature, his broken hand guided by a court official like a child's crayon, gripped by a weary teacher. His mother, Queen Mariana, still controlled access to him like a gatekeeper to a sacred relic, except this relic trembled and wept and screamed in the night. One morning, Charles asked why the candles never went out. No one had the courage to tell him it was because if they did, the rats might bite him. That's not metaphor. That's history. At court, a new fear began to take hold. Not that Charles would die, but that he would linger, rotting, decaying, and the empire would die with him one slow breath at a time. So they turned to something older than medicine, older than reason: exorcism. Priests were summoned, dozens. They chanted in Latin and Basque, sprinkled holy water on his bloated limbs, rubbed relics on his forehead. At one point, they brought a monk who claimed the king had been bewitched through poisoned chocolate and a spell sewn into his bed linens. Charles believed them. Of course he did. When your whole life is performance, truth feels like fiction, and fiction becomes salvation. But here's the truth they refused to see. The devil hadn't cursed Charles. His ancestors had. With every cousin kissed on the mouth, with every niece turned bride, with every generation that folded the gene pool inward, like a map to nowhere. By the time Charles reached his 30s, his face had begun to cave in. His skin sagged, his eyes clouded with cataracts, his thoughts flickered in and out like candlelight behind cracked glass, but still they called him Majesty, and still they prayed for an heir. Now comment below. Blood is not sacred. Blood is a warning. Write it twice. Burn the illusion. Claim your clarity. They called it divine mystery. But behind closed doors, Charles wasn't worshipped. He was managed. He couldn't read, couldn't write. He stared for hours at flickering candlelight or mumbled to himself while tracing the embroidery on his robe as if searching for meaning in patterns that no longer made sense. He was not ruling Spain. He was rotting inside a golden cage, and no one dared say it aloud. The nobles bowed. The ministers smiled. But behind those courtly grins was terror, not just of the king's decay, but of what that decay revealed about the empire itself. His tutors wrote desperate letters. They said Charles couldn't concentrate, couldn't be taught, couldn't be reached. He would fly into rages, chewing on furniture, slapping attendants, smearing food on the walls, then collapsing into silence like a broken toy, a haunted marionette whose strings had long since snapped. Foreign diplomats came and left in shock. One whispered, "The king seems more like a mistake preserved by divine inertia than a monarch." And yet the court insisted he was wise, silent because he contemplates, slow because he is deliberate, sickly because he is holy, lies upon lies until even the lies were rotting, because everyone knew Spain was running out of time. Charles had to produce an heir, so they prepared him for marriage, a ceremony, a public event, a desperate gamble against biology. They dressed him in silks, painted his face, taught him phrases to say. The king, now in his 20s, couldn't even chew bread, but he would take a queen. They shipped in a teenage French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans, who had no idea she was walking into a decaying crypt wearing a wedding dress. She was 17. He was a corpse in a crown. And what happened behind those royal bedroom doors was the final act of a dynasty trying to breed with death. But we'll get there. For now, understand this. The performance continued, because it had to. Because if the truth got out, that the king was incapable, the bloodline ruined, the empire cursed, then the entire illusion would crumble. And institutions like these, they'll burn cities to keep the illusion alive, even if it means placing a rotting boy on a throne of bones. Her name was Maria Anna of Neuburg, German, iron-willed, political, not a bride, a last-ditch experiment. Her family was renowned for one thing, fertility. 10 siblings, dozens of offspring. If any woman could stretch the broken Habsburg line 1 inch further, it would be her. She arrived with midwives, apothecaries, and priests in tow, a caravan of hope marching straight into a palace of rot. The mission was clear, bear an heir. But when she met her husband, what she saw made her skin crawl. Charles had aged another decade since Marie-Louise. His teeth were nearly all gone. His skin sagged. He coughed blood in the mornings. His bones bent like wax left too close to a candle. He couldn't climb stairs. He couldn't finish a sentence. He barely recognized faces anymore. Maria Anna swallowed her terror. She smiled for the court. She performed her duties like a soldier, but the royal bedchamber remained a grave. For months, she tried. Rituals, baths, prayers, still no heir. The king, once described as bewitched, was now seen as cursed. And as hope dissolved, the queen began to wither. She stopped smiling. Her appetite vanished. The sparkle in her eye turned dull, as if she, too, was becoming part of the Habsburg tomb. But Charles? He lingered. By 30, he looked 70. He defecated black tar laced with blood. He choked on soft bread. He couldn't stand for more than minutes at a time. His hair fell in clumps. His eyes, once merely vacant, now twitched, haunted and searching, as if even his soul wanted out of the skull that trapped it. Yet still they dressed him in velvet. Still they powdered his face for court. Still they adjusted his trembling crown. The court, unable to accept reality, turned to exorcism. They stripped him naked, doused him in holy water, screamed Latin invocations over his body, burned herbs beneath his bed, forced him to confess sins he couldn't understand. One priest declared, "The king has been cursed by a Moorish sorcerer for the sins of his ancestors." But no one mentioned chromosomes. No one dared whisper what every doctor already knew. This was not witchcraft. This was inbreeding. This was punishment passed through blood. And Charles wasn't its victim. He was its embodiment. By now the palace no longer functioned like a court. It resembled a shrine, but not for a god, for a rotting relic. Charles's body had become something sacred, not because it was divine, but because it was the last link in a bloodline that had run out of road. Every breath was treated like a miracle, every twitch a sign from heaven. But what they wouldn't admit, what they couldn't admit, was that Spain was being ruled by a corpse in slow motion. Attendants dressed him each morning in velvet robes. They placed the crown on his sagging head. Then they stood him before the court like a melting wax figure. His eyes clouded, his voice slurred. He spoke to shadows no one else could see, and the ministers, they nodded solemnly, pretending his mutterings were wisdom. There was no heir. There would never be one. But no one dared say it aloud. Maria Anna tried everything. She brought relics from saints. She ordered spiritual investigations. Priests examined the ashes of Charles's first wife, claiming her ghost had poisoned his seed. Others declared the king's impotence the result of sorcery-fed chocolate or demonic energy nesting in the royal bed. But no one dared speak of genes, because to speak the truth would unravel the entire illusion. Charles believed it all. Of course he did. He had been raised in lies, crowned by ghosts, fed by superstition. Now, as his organs failed and his mind dissolved into fog, he clung to holy water and whispered prayers to saints who never came. He wore amulets around his neck. He begged monks to cleanse him. He slept beside talismans. He wept like a child. And the court wept with him, because they weren't mourning the king. They were mourning the myth, the end of an idea. The House of Habsburg had ruled for centuries, but this trembling figure in gold, was its final breath. His ministers feared the day he would stop breathing, but they feared more what would come after. There was no successor, no son, no future, only vultures. And across Europe, powerful families were already circling, hungry, patient, ready. When a kingdom is dying, the walls whisper first. And in Madrid, those whispers were now roars. Every corridor of the royal palace echoed with conspiracy, servants pausing mid-step, courtiers exchanging coded glances, foreign ambassadors smiling too widely. Behind their silk sleeves, everyone clutched a knife, not for the king, but for each other. Because Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was dying, and everyone wanted to inherit his corpse. France circled like a lion, its king, Louis XIV, eager to place his grandson on the Spanish throne. Austria loomed with equal hunger, claiming that only another Habsburg, however distant, could preserve the bloodline. England, the Dutch, the Papal States, they all watched like carrion birds, waiting for the empire to fall apart so they could feast on its limbs. Inside the palace, the queen grew paranoid. Maria Anna of Neuburg, once confident and calculating, now locked herself in prayer chambers, lighting candles by the dozens. She wore black even before her husband's death, sensing the kingdom's soul had already left its body. Each morning she kissed the dying king's forehead, and each evening she rewrote her alliances. And Charles? He no longer understood time. He thought his dead mother still ruled. He addressed the empty air as if it were full of nobles long buried. He mistook his own reflection for enemies. The physicians lied, as they always had. He's recovering, they said, while stuffing herbs into his mouth to mask the odor of decay. But his breath was shallow. His teeth were gone. His legs grotesquely swollen with fluid. And still, they waited, because Spain had no plan B. Every day, foreign spies crept closer into the court. They bribed cooks, seduced maids, blackmailed clerks, anyone who might hint at what Charles might sign in his final lucid moment. A will, a decree, an endorsement, anything that would turn Europe to ash and blood, because everyone knew when Charles died, Europe would go to war. He was the last domino in a line stretching back centuries, and when he finally fell, he wouldn't just take the Habsburgs with him, he'd take peace itself. The empire was already dead, but the world hadn't realized it yet. There was no fanfare, no trumpet, no miracle. Charles II, the last of Spain's Habsburg kings, died the way he had lived, quietly, grotesquely, and surrounded by liars. November 1st, 1700. The candles in his chamber had long since melted down to waxy puddles. The priests, exhausted from weeks of last rites, chanted out of habit. And the courtiers, they stood frozen, faces trained into solemn masks, but behind their eyes burned something dangerous: relief. Charles didn't gasp or scream. He simply stopped twitching, stopped drooling, stopped murmuring names from dynasties that no longer existed. The body remained slumped on the velvet chair for hours. No one dared move it, not out of reverence, but because no one wanted to be first. First to acknowledge the illusion had ended. First to admit that the king, the illusion of a king, was finally gone. They embalmed him in secret. They dressed the corpse in gold-threaded robes, fitted a crown atop his sunken skull, and displayed him for 3 days under flickering chandeliers. The people wept, but they didn't really know why. They wept for the end of an empire, not for the man, because the truth, known only to those closest, was unbearable. Charles had never truly ruled. He had been displayed, like a relic, like a warning. And now, with him gone, the gates of hell cracked open. The moment his death was announced, Europe ignited. Treaties were burned. Marriages unraveled. Ambassadors abandoned diplomacy and began whispering to generals. It was no longer about succession. It was about power. Power over Spain. Power over its gold. Power over its colonies, armies, oceans. France declared its claim first. Austria screamed betrayal. England, Holland, and others joined in, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun, and it would kill over 1 million souls. All because of a curse, with a crown. All because one family, drunk on its own blood, refused to let go. In the end, Charles left behind no heir, but he left behind something far worse. A void. A black hole in the heart of Europe that would swallow kings, crush armies, and tear maps apart. This was never just about a malformed boy on a throne. It was about the monstrous legacy of those who believed their blood was sacred, even as it rotted them from the inside. They buried him beneath marble, beneath symbols of divine authority, royal lineage, and eternal empire. But no stone could contain the truth. Charles II was not a martyr. He was not a king. He was a manifestation, a flesh-and-bone consequence of arrogance, denial, and centuries of incestuous pride. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one, but magic had nothing to do with it. The Habsburgs had not been cursed by witches. They had cursed themselves, generation after generation, sacrificing vitality for vanity, strength for legacy, sanity for symbolism. And in the end, all they created was a boy with a crown and no future. The war his death sparked would reshape Europe. Empires collapsed, new powers rose, and the throne of Spain, once thought eternal, became a prize passed between foreign hands. But what if I told you, the real horror isn't in the twisted body of Charles II. The real horror is in how far institutions will go to preserve the illusion of power. You saw it in the priests who sprinkled holy water instead of medicine, in the portraits painted to hide deformity, in the nobles who bowed to a dying shell just to keep their titles alive. They didn't just lie to the people, they lied to themselves. And now, centuries later, we ask, have we changed? Or have we just found new ways to paint the corpse? New crowns, new rituals, new illusions. Every empire believes its bloodline is sacred. Every institution believes it cannot fall. But history whispers the truth in ruined palaces and crumbling churches. Rot doesn't begin at the edges. It starts at the heart. So the next time you see a perfect image, a politician polished like gold, a system claiming infallibility, a lineage declared divine, look closer. Does it speak wisdom, or does it merely drool in silence? Comment, the crown is a lie, twice below if you're awake enough to see it. And remember, truth is not gentle. It doesn't knock. It shatters the door. Now that you've stepped inside, there's no going back. Welcome to the Black Chapter.